how you got started. Like, what was life like for Chris Bundgaard?
I was probably about your age, maybe a couple of years older, and I was in graduate school at the University of Minnesota, and I wasn't making much money. I think I was a bartender at the time. And I was looking around town just for anything, and to get in, whether it be in print or in broadcast. We didn't have many other options then, or radio. And I found a job at a CBS affiliate, WCCO television, kind of not really an entry-level position. It was a position called a dispatcher, news dispatcher. You listened to police radios, fire radios. You worked on an assignment desk, like a city editor in a newspaper, and you helped them, keep track of crews. And I think I was paid a grand total of $2.65 an hour. Essentially, I was looking for anything, and that was one thing. I knew somebody working there. I was lucky to get in, and that was how I started. I went to undergrad at a small liberal arts college in Minnesota called St. Olaf, and I think I majored in psychology and English, and I think even on our website I say I had a latent desire or a latent ambition to get into journalism. I got into the master's program at the University of Minnesota, but after a while you start getting pretty itchy to get out and really start doing stuff. The University of Minnesota Daily, which had circulation of 75,000 people, had a long list of kids, that wanted to write for it. So, you might get one thing a month printed. So I really wanted to get out and do something. Early on, at least that time, and I think it's still true for local television news, you go to a small market and you do everything. You have a concentration maybe, like if you're in news, you might report, you might do a little anchoring where you're like filling in on weekends or in the mornings. You might produce a newscast where you're the person putting together the newscast, deciding what order stories go in, that sort of thing. That's what I did in Corpus Christi, Texas. Loved it. When you get out and do your first job, you'll really love your first job. You really will, because it's just everything's new, and most of the people you work with are close to your age, and they're new too. So that's always exciting. As a broadcast journalist, it is, it's a collaborative thing you do. Your voice is on it. You say it's your story. That sort of thing. You actually write the words, but in most cases, there's another person running the camera, and they're very important. I mean, if you don't have good pictures and sound, good pictures, your radio. As I'm sure you've learned, you can tell a lot of great stories with just a few pictures. Just like the old saying goes. And the way those pictures are put together and the suggestions a photographer might make are really good. Suggestions a producer might make and kind of looking at your copy. Understanding, how you're sent here and sent there and the time limits. You kind of learn that as an assignment editor. So knowing all those things and knowing a little bit about the technical part of it. And nowadays, you add social media into it. Bad weather comes, I'll just sit here and start taking, I'll probably hold it down so it'll be steady, but I can capture incredible pictures, and it can be live at the same time. I think it's kind of the wild, wild west out there right now as far as how social media fits in. I know in talking to some of our interns at Channel 2, I know they're learning that everything is about social media. Organizations have renamed, like the Radio Television News Directors Association renamed itself, they put digital in there. Everybody is trying to figure out exactly how social media should fit into journalism. There's no question, it's here to stay in some fashion. When you can somebody can send me a message and I can verify it with an email and then put it out on Twitter, maybe even put a picture or a video out on, you know, just like we do every day about, you know, and how we communicate with people. But when I can do that, and if I've got several hundred or several thousand Twitter followers, I mean, you know, you hear this all the time. The story broke he broke it on it, or she broke it on their Twitter account, you know, or on Facebook, or they posted something. You feel your tweet is maybe not first, like we always like to be. You still put it out there because you have followers, and they're kind of looking at you like you're a news source, and that's a little hard for me to always understand. I mean, I'm still, you know, I like to think that, okay, I'm writing this story for tonight at 5 o'clock, and the idea that I'm talking about it during the day is sort of foreign. You want it, you know, the first time you want people to know about this or to look at the full story is when you do it at 5 o'clock. But I'm learning that no, that's just part of it. You should be tweeting and Facebooking, and the carrying on the conversation part of it is a little different for me. You've got a lot of goofballs who, you know, they'll make silly comments about something, and there are very legitimate people who want to converse with you, but you go, oh, I'm busy typing this story. I don't have all that information. But you can also say, you know, here's what I know now. I'm going to know more at 5 and 6, or on the web story, which I write later. I was coming home in January from a night class, and it was 28 degrees real temperature, below zero, not wind chill, 28 below. I was riding a bus, and buses were breaking down, and we were all huddled by a bus stop. I'd never been so cold in my life. The wind was whipping down the Mississippi River. There was no barriers. We're just all huddled and cold. And then the bus didn't have any heater on it when we finally got on. At least it was running. So eventually I got home to my apartment, and I pulled out an atlas. We didn't have any maps on things like this back then. It was a big old atlas. And I drew a line from San Diego, California to Miami. And I said, I'm going to look for a job along that line. Corpus Christi was right in the middle. Knew somebody who was going down there to be a news director, and called them up, and they flew me down, and it was a very different from, you know, the urban environment of the Twin Cities to Corpus Christi, Texas, which is, you'll hear Spanish as much as you'll hear English. You can smell the oil that's being pumped in the Gulf of Mexico, all those rigs, and there are lots and lots of beaches. So it was very different than Minnesota, and I enjoyed it thoroughly. I went to Salt Lake City, Utah, which was a wonderful place as well, very dramatic landscape with the mountains, the desert, and of course the Mormons, which is, you know, you sort of, you know, they're, if you're not LDS, as they like to say there, you sort of have to learn something about it, because that's where a lot of Mormons live, and that's where the religion not started, but that's where it flourished, of course. If you were to work ever in a place like Utah, you know, you have to be, you know, one of the things that you would be cognizant of is that 70%, 80% of the state are Mormon. You have to learn a little bit about that. I mean, you know, and it's obviously very pervasive in the political realm. You know, Mitt Romney kind of had to explain his Mormon religion, and I think he did, and I don't think it was a huge issue in the past election. I mean, from not being a Mormon, when you're non-Mormon, you're called a Gentile. But there were things you kind of learn along the way, and there are many, many, many wonderful people. You also have to recognize and try and understand something about the religion, because it does come into play, you know, in almost everything that goes on in the fabric of everyday Utah. You know, from the governors, politicians, schools, most teachers. You know, 70% of the population is Mormon. So. But I found it all very interesting. I mean, I don't know how much it directly impacted. I mean, those influences. I guess when I got here, you know, you're you're more, it prepares you when you have some very dominant characteristics like the Hispanic influence in Corpus, the Mormon influence in Salt Lake. It kind of readies you a little bit. Okay, you know, when I was moving here, I go, okay, what about Nashville? It's in the South. Well, that's going to be. I've lived in the South, so I wasn't too worried about that. As far as something different than what I was used to. But then, of course, you know about music, and you know country music, and I thought, well, what's this town going to be like? Is it just going to be a bunch of hicks? Is it? And very, very quickly, I learned that the nickname Music City is much better nickname for Nashville than the country music. One thing I wasn't ready for, or I didn't understand, is in the South, and you may know this from growing up here, I looked at Nashville, it became very apparent to me that Nashville is still a segregated town. I don't mean that in a traditional sense of how we look at segregation, like in the civil rights era between white and black. I look at it more economically, more where people live. I mean, you know, there were people that I know who grew up in Belmead or in Green Hills. They never went across the river to go to East Nashville.
Yeah, because I grew up in East Nashville,
yeah,
and I still live in East Nashville.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Exactly.
Nashville may be the world's largest small town, and it's kind of like, which is great, but it's also a series of small towns. I mean, there are people in Belmead who've never been to Antioch or East Nashville, like I mentioned, or Hermitage. I'm rarely in Hermitage, you know, or Donaldson. I mean, very distinct parts of this town where people kind of, you know, they grew up together, they went back to the same parts. Brentwood's very different from Hendersonville. You know, there are people who love to live out by those lakes out there, Old Hickory Lake or Percy Priest. I mean, this is a very diverse town, I think, which I think, you know, it's in recent years and over the decades, the last couple of decades, I think Nashville has seen that its diversity is also a strength, and it's come to celebrate that, and I think that's pretty cool. We all knew that Saturday afternoon, after it had been raining for about 24 hours, and all of a sudden we start getting text messages or phone calls from somebody going, hey, yeah, I don't know if I can get over it. I mean, it's really funny. I'm stuck. I mean, I'm at an intersection and they closed it off. I mean, we're starting to flood a little bit. You know, we started hearing stories like that. And of course, as a news person, I remember sitting looking at the television, and you have those Department of Transportation cameras where you see pictures and you start seeing freeways flooded. There was that picture of what looked like a house floating down.
Floating down.
Yeah, exactly. When I saw that and I saw it, I go, holy cow.
Like, I saw that and was like, okay, this is serious. And then, like, I instantly started getting phone calls from friends from different states saying,
what is going on?
Are you guys okay?
Yeah.
What's going on?
Yeah, and that's when I grabbed my boots and my bag, and off I went with my camera, very similar to that one, by myself. And it was difficult getting into work. And it was difficult just, I mean, I remember calling in and going, well, I'm at an intersection. It's incredible here. I mean, there are cars submerged. There are people wandering around saying, I can't get anywhere. Or I mean, everywhere I go, it's blocked somehow because the water's come up. And there's some people that were swimming through it by then. And that event, those events were repeated day or hour after hour for what, 3 days, and then we had where, even when it stopped raining, you know, the reservoir out there at Old Hickory was so bulging, you know, almost overflowing up there, that they had to open up the gates. Still controversial about that. And that's when really some serious damage, because all that water was there and had to go somewhere, and that's what a lot of parts of Nashville, most of the time, and in fact all of the time, up until then, in the history of the United States, at least sometimes races weren't done until, even if they were very, very close, 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning. Usually at that point, one of the anchors, or you'd say, we have called this for somebody. Didn't happen that night. Yeah. You know, it was like tie. And then it was, and with Mr. Gore, who was from Tennessee, his headquarters were up here at the Capitol at Legislative Plaza. I was down there. Incredible night. Saw every politician in the world, saw every Democrat in the world, big crowd. We're right in the middle of it, and then it's the most historic, unusual election in U.S. history. And then we're back at it. We were running around until 7 in the morning, and then we're a couple hours sleep, and then we're back at it. That was a pretty incredible time, and I cover politics, so that's one thing I remember. And then another story that will always stay with me, a few years ago when the recession hit so hard here in Tennessee and all over the country after the economic collapse and the housing market collapse in 2007. There was a small county in Tennessee called Perry County. It was almost 30%. I mean, these were levels that we had not heard of in this country since the Great Depression. And I remember going over to that county and finding out what had happened. They lost a car supply plant, just closed down, and there were hundreds of families over there where both the mother and the father were unemployed. And so I did a series of reports over the period of a couple of years about what are they doing, how are they getting back on their feet. It was a really marvelous story, and I met some wonderful people. Boy, their country over there, but they're resilient. And that, you know, people really opened up to me about how difficult it was, but they still kept the spirit, which I think whenever you do a story like that, you see somebody who is about as down could be, except for their faith maybe, and their resilience and their hope. And they never lost that. They may have lost jobs, but they never lost that. That stayed with them. Nothing cookie cutter. I mean, I think, you know, on television maybe in certain periods of time, people got to look a certain way, but I see all kinds of people on television now, which is great. You know, we see young women, we see young men, we see a fair amount of people of color. We see older people, which I'm all in favor of because I'm a little older these days. You know, we see people who have accents. We see people who don't sound like, you know, they're the broadcaster next door. You know, we see and hear people that, you know, have something to say. You're always curious about not just the world, but your neighborhood. You know, and you're curious about things just as you walk to work. If you lose that curiosity and you've got to be able to listen to people and hear their stories. And then you retell them. I mean, it's really kind of, you know, whether you're writing a blog, you're writing a tweet, 140 characters, or you're doing a documentary. You're listening to people, and they tell you things, and then you retell it as best you can in an honest and you know, a representation of what they're telling you. Tough part is when, you know, it's a conflict. You got to pick, you know, okay, what's the most important thing about this conflict that I want to tell people so that they understand it? And sometimes you have to leave stuff out, but you want to be able to tell a story, and you got to be able to listen to people, and you got to be curious. Any writer, any broadcaster, anybody editing something will tell you, you know, if you don't enjoy that in the sense of, I mean, sure, there's going to be lots of stuff that's difficult getting to that point. In other words, you may not like your editor, you may not like your producer, you may not like when you first start out on a story because it's difficult. People won't call you back, or, you know, the research you found isn't very good, or you know, your computer's off, or your phone dies. You know, all these things that happen during the day. You'll get wet. You know, you're out there, you get cold. You know, it's too hot. All these things, and you're out in and out, and all this stuff. But when you sit down, and whether it's sitting typing it on your phone, or you're dictating, or you're, you know, sitting at your laptop or on your iPad and writing the story, that's when, if you lose that, you know, I don't want to do this anymore, or this is becoming drudgery, you know, that's when you know you got to go do something else. Because you still want to have that, I want to make this the best thing possible, you know. I think there's an old legendary basketball coach called John Wooden. You may know him if you follow athletic history, and he won 10 out of 12 championships, which is unheard of in the NCAA men's basketball. And I think he had a line, he may have borrowed it from somebody else, but he said something about try to make every day your masterpiece. I mean, these are funny little cliches, but they really do mean something. And I think each day in journalism, you know, there are going to be days that are really difficult, and you don't hit that homer. You aren't even close to a masterpiece. You don't even have the colors right. But if you know you've tried and you know that you can come back tomorrow and it's, you know, if you start losing that, you know, again, find another job. But, you know, as long as you have that, it's still a pretty enjoyable way to make a living.